The breaking news we are covering tonight is the government shutdown deadline now an hour away. And right now, one man, Republican Senator Rand Paul, stands in the way of a vote. And a shutdown tonight would be the second time in 20 days. Plus, another unfolding crisis for this White House after allegations of domestic abuse have led to the departure of another close aide to this president. And tonight, one of Rob Porter's two ex-wives has spoken with NBC News. The 11th hour on a Thursday night begins now. Well, good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York. Day 385 of the Trump administration. It now appears we are indeed headed toward the second government shutdown in less than 3 weeks. The U.S. Senate has adjourned until 12:01 a.m., and that means, by definition, that'll be a minute after the government is set to shut down. At issue here, federal funds run out at the stroke of midnight. The Senate has yet to vote on a bipartisan agreed-to spending plan, agreed to yesterday, as we heard in their announcement by the leaders Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. The bill adds up to a massive increase in domestic and defense spending, about $400 billion for 2 years. And out of 100 U.S. senators, one man, Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, has been holding up the vote. He's been speaking on the floor tonight, not a filibuster technically, but blocking any other progress in an attempt to force a separate vote on an amendment to reverse spending increases.
I ran for office because I was very critical of President Obama's trillion-dollar deficits. Now we have Republicans hand in hand with Democrats offering us trillion-dollar deficits. I can't, in all good honesty and all good faith, just look the other way because my party is now complicit in the deficits. What we're looking at is a bill that was decided in secret. 700 pages were printed last night at midnight, released at midnight, and for the most part have not been read. If you were against President Obama's trillion-dollar debts, trillion-dollar deficits, why are you for trillion-dollar deficits when you just simply put a Republican name on it?
Well, remember, Senator Rand Paul is a Republican, the libertarian branch of the Republican Party, to be sure, but there's an R after his name. And under the Senate rules, Senator Paul can delay a vote until 1 a.m. Here is what fellow Republican, the number 2 Republican in the Senate, John Cornyn of Texas, had to say about Rand Paul.
So, the senator from Kentucky, by objecting to the unanimous consent request, will effectively shut down the federal government for no real reason. I know he wants to make a point. He has that right. I agree with many of his concerns about deficits and debt, but we are in an emergency situation.
So nice to see everybody getting along. Wherever the Senate votes, whenever they vote, the spending plan has to then clear the House, where it faces opposition from a number of Democrats who are not in the majority because it fails to protect the dreamers. Today, House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi said she will not support the bill unless Speaker Paul Ryan promises a House vote on the continuation of the DACA program. Now, let us bring in our own Garrett Hake, live at Capitol Hill. Garrett, I understand the clock to run this way. The House has been told to come to work and be prepared for a vote between 3 and 6 a.m.?
Yeah, Brian, and that's probably an optimistic assessment of how early the House could vote. Rand Paul could run the clock out till at least 1. Then there's a series of votes that has to happen in the Senate. Long story short, it would take a little while to get this 700-page or so bill transmitted to the House and in a situation where they can vote on it. So it's entirely likely, if not essentially guaranteed at this point, that federal workers and folks around the country will wake up tomorrow morning and find their government shut down. It's just a question now of for how long that's going to happen. You laid some of this out at the top. Rand Paul, as any other senator would, has enormous power, the way the Senate rules are structured, to slow things down. But he can't stop this vote. Ultimately, this deal, this bill, will pass in the United States Senate. What you've got right now is Rand Paul acting as sort of the nagging conscience of a Republican Party that no longer feels, broadly speaking, the same way he does about debt and deficits, and he's going to remind them of that tonight, slowly and painfully, until the clock runs out, and this vote has to happen sometime in the very early hours of Friday.
Speaking of slow and painful, we have a former chairman of the Republican Party in this studio who I'm going to get to in just a minute to talk about some of this. You see right there Eli Stokols and Michael Steele. But Garrett, it is true as a factual matter that deficits have gone up under Republican presidents in the modern era and down or zeroed out under the Democrats. And Rand Paul's critics have said, now, wait a minute. Republicans in the Senate can't ram through the tax cut that we have just witnessed and then complain about $1 trillion federal deficit.
Yeah, and without making any value judgment on the claim, I will say that Republicans make the argument that they will say that this is logically consistent because by cutting taxes, they think that they are starving or shrinking government. So in that view, if you want to look at it holistically, at least the way that many Republicans do, that is the people's money, not necessarily the government's money, doesn't belong to them. That's how they make that argument. But it is very difficult to square if you just care about the bottom line, that these two things aren't obviously related. And that's the argument from the left against Rand Paul on this. He has done the impossible tonight. I mean, he has united essentially everyone in the United States Senate, including other senators who will ultimately vote against this package in opposition to the way that he is handling this. They want to see a deal done, a vote taken so that they can go home for the night and also continue to fund the federal government and get on with all these other issues, including that immigration debate, which is going to be a big deal in the Senate next week and in the House in the weeks to come. Part of the reason the House Democrats are so twisted up about this vote, which now they'll make probably Friday morning over breakfast.
Well, let's talk about that immigration thing for just a second, because the last time we were in this situation, going into what we knew was going to be a long night of a shutdown, we heard Mitch McConnell at the end of the night promise to bring up DACA. And I believe it was in the realm of kind of a let's resolve DACA by itself with nothing cluttering it. Is that what we're talking about next week?
Not exactly. What the Majority Leader has now said is that he will bring essentially a clean bill, almost a blank sheet of paper, to the floor of the Senate and let senators fight it out. It's going to be extraordinary for people who've been following Congress over the last few years. This kind of thing just isn't done anymore. It will be a wide open amendment process. Let the best idea win. So even Democratic senators who are skeptical of the Majority Leader have now heard him say this enough times that they trust that there will be an open process, but no one in this town or anywhere else can tell you what's going to come out of that process in the Senate. In the House, Democrats don't have any other leverage point over Paul Ryan except this vote right now on funding the government for the next month or so. So they would be entirely dependent on the Speaker's goodwill to have a similar project such as this. You heard Nancy Pelosi say, let's have a Queen of the Hill bill just like this in the House. So far, Paul Ryan hasn't been willing to go for that. He wants to make sure whatever he brings to the floor in the House has the president's support, and nailing that down has been extraordinarily difficult for anyone, Brian.
Garrett, we're going to talk to you later in the hour, but before I let you go, while still a young man, you are already a grizzled veteran of the Hill, and there are always two indications that the Senate is secretly planning to go later than posted times. That is the arrival of one or both of these things: pizzas in bulk and cots, the kind they wheel around the Hill. Have you seen evidence of either?
Brian, I've seen significant quantities of pizza, but no cots thus far.
All right, Garrett Hake with the pizza confirmation tonight from the halls of Congress. We'll be back in touch. Thank you, buddy. And here with us in New York for more, as I said, former RNC Chairman Michael Steele and MSNBC political analyst Eli Stokols. Why are you smiling, Mr. Chairman?
It's all so amusing.
Yeah, right until you remember how serious it is. Right until you remember this is our government at work, or
that's the sad part.
Not at work.
It's not at work, and the thing about it, you finally get to a bipartisan moment. It's tenuous, but it's there.
Yeah, which we witnessed this week. We actually had one of those.
Actually watched it happen, and everybody's like, okay, here we go, and here we are tonight with less than an hour before the whole thing closes down. But here's the part that I like and appreciate what Rand Paul is saying. I mean, at the bottom, as a fiscal conservative, I'm sitting there going, I remember getting a lot of guys elected to the Congress who were concerned about the debt and the deficit and would not spend $1 more than we were taking in. But you just passed a tax bill where you just increased the national debt by $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So how can we now all of a sudden find sanctimony about spending $300 billion and trying to get this 2-year budget in place and then move on to go back and figure out how, because you're going to have to come here again. This is not the last time you're going to have this conversation on either the debt, the debt ceiling, or the deficit.
Eli, I watched carefully the conversation tonight on Rachel's broadcast and Lawrence's broadcast, and a lot of people have been careful not to confuse Rand Paul with Jimmy Stewart. I think that's the most polite way of putting this, that Rand Paul, while he has had some principled, again, libertarian wing of the Republican Party stands, is not winning friends tonight in that chamber.
No, and that's one of the more normal aspects of this. I mean, the Republican Party these days, we don't really know what it is. So it's almost comforting to see something familiar, which is Rand Paul upsetting all of his Republican colleagues. Yeah. That seems familiar here. But, you know, we just don't really know. I mean, ideological consistency is something that matters, I guess, or that is something that is ripe for your opponent to go after you on in either a primary or perhaps in a general election. But in Donald Trump's Republican Party, I mean, Donald Trump personifies ideological incoherence and malleability and switching back and forth in positions. And he gets away with it. And what I think members, some members care more about being ideologically consistent than others, but you know, we've seen Republican members of Congress, they're not Donald Trump. They can't all get away with the same things that he does. And you know, you can foresee a situation going into the election where some members are held to account.
Let me bring in one more member of our TV family for tonight. Rachel Bade of Politico has been standing by on Capitol Hill. Of course, it sounds like the Snickers commercial, not going anywhere for a while. We appreciate you spending part of your free time tonight with us. Rachel, what have we missed that you have witnessed or picked up on the Hill? What's been missing from our conversation that you could add?
So basically, we're hearing that Republicans and Democrats here on the Hill are expecting a shutdown of about 6 to 7 hours. It sounds like the Senate's going to get ready to vote around 2 or 3. The House actually needs about 4 hours to get something ready in this chamber to actually reopen the government. And then that's assuming that Nancy Pelosi actually caves on a demand that she's been making of Paul Ryan, that he make a promise to hold a DACA vote before she backs this budget. Now, a lot of my Republican sources, they're feeling pretty confident that she's going to either cave herself or that a number of her Democratic folks in the conference are going to join Republicans to reopen the government. And the reason why is because they're expecting a very strong vote in the Senate at 3 a.m., of course, when the world is sleeping, but that will put a lot of pressure on the Democrats over here, and ultimately, perhaps they'll be able to reopen the government before anybody even wakes up and tries to go to work and might be sent home if they're a government employee.
Rachel, we talked about this last time. Shutdowns have real consequences because at midnight there is the chance that, again, a CDC researcher in Atlanta who's chasing down a strain of flu that's affecting children will have to put his or her research down. A park ranger getting ready for visitors tomorrow in California. A military contractor in charge of the chow line at any number of our domestic or overseas bases will either have to stop work or expect a difference in their paycheck because of this. So there are real-life consequences far from Capitol Hill. What lawmakers have you run into tonight who have a kind of seething frustration because they know that this matters? We're able to see this, and we're kind of taking account of it.
Yeah, so I talked to Charlie Dent just a couple of hours ago here, and he said something about Rand Paul and the neighbor that actually beat him up. He said something, I wish the neighbor, or I understand why the neighbor did what he did, which is perhaps not the most professional thing to say, but just shows you the level of anger. Charlie Dent is leaving Congress after all. Yes, he's leaving Congress. He's always a great quote, very bold, speaks his mind. But that just, again, shows you the level of anger Republicans have at Rand Paul right now. The thing they point out is that, yes, he's taking a stand. He's saying saying, you know, this is not offset, this is not what fiscal conservatives should be backing, and he's objecting to the process. We just saw this 700-page bill 24 hours ago. No member clearly has had time to go through this before they cast this vote. But shutting down the government is irresponsible, obviously, and that's why a lot of people, frankly, don't approve of Congress, and Congress has terrible approval ratings. So there's a lot of anger on this, and through it all, it's not going to change anything. The government's going to be closed for how many hours, and ultimately there's going to be no change in the text that you see right now on the floor.
Rachel, thank you. I know you wanted to report more joyful news than this tonight, but I sure appreciate your candor and your late live reporting from Capitol Hill on a busier than usual night at this hour. Rachel Bade with Politico, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Chairman, she quotes Congressman Dent, who, longtime Republican from Pennsylvania, has decided, I'm done with this, though he was just as candid in his quotes before deciding to leave Congress.
Well, he, along with 36 other House Republicans and Senate Republicans who decided to hang up the shingle. And there's a reason for that, because it's not a fun place to work. It's certainly not a fun place when you had ideals of going there and sort of laying down some core principles and attaching that to legislation and creating good policy. So that's the idea. What's happened is something that you mentioned, is that there's such a rot and such a way that the system is working, it just grinds itself down to a stop. And that's where we are right now. You think about this, folks. This is the second shutdown in 2 weeks. I mean, really?
Like it's normal.
Well, like it's normal. And when you start accepting this as leaders, the country has to ask itself, what type of men and women are we sending to represent us? What type of men and women are prepared to do the heavy lift? Just how important is that job? Is that job more important than the very things you listed? You know, the contractors, the men and women out there,
the
CDC, those folks who are on the front lines. You know, government's a bureaucracy, but beneath that are a lot of people who go to work to do very important things on behalf of the American people. And in less than an hour, they're sitting there going, well, what do I do? Do I go to work? Do I not go to work? And oh, by the way, how much of my paycheck is going to get impacted by this in 2 weeks? So it's a big deal. I'd expect a more responsible response from my party leaders right at this point. They were there. They cut the bipartisan deal. Now they got to go cut a deal with Rand Paul.
Eli Stokols, you have covered Donald Trump since the beginning. Where is Donald Trump, literally and figuratively, tonight?
Well, the lights are off in the residence. I mean, he may be asleep. And it just tells you, I mean, what Michael's talking about is true, that this is the second potential shutdown in 20 days, and it barely registers. It's leading your broadcast most likely because it's about to happen within the hour. And yet, just a couple hours ago, there was so much other news in the churn about this White House, about all the other things that happened, and this has been happening. I know, but this is the story of the presidency, and so I think it doesn't really register for most people. This is where we're at now, is that you can have 2 government shutdowns within 3 weeks, and people just sort of shrug. It has become the norm. They say, you know, don't normalize or don't get used to this, don't accept this.
The new normal.
I mean, this is the government we've got, and this is where we're at. And I think people, you know, to a lot of people in terms of what they're upset about, this probably isn't even the top thing.
What do I always say about politics? It's the one business where we, the people, are the customers and the boss at the same time.
That's right. And a lot of Americans have forgotten the fact that they're the boss. And talking about the boss, the question is, just how many phone calls have been placed from the White House tonight to the Senate floor to get the senator to stand down? Senator, I'm behind this bill.
Yeah.
So I need you to stand down for the good of the country and the good of the party, all right? So let's put it all on the table. Because as president, I need you to stand with me on this. Where's that phone call? Because that's the leadership you need right now at this hour.
The president did tweet about Mark Warner about an hour ago.
Oh, that's good. That was very helpful.
Well, and you know, Rand Paul is someone who has tried to develop something of a relationship with this president. They've been golfing several times. And so you would think if the White House thought to pick up the phone and say, hey, what can we do to just move this along and avoid the shutdown for the American people? But just rewind a couple days. I know it's hard to remember. You have the president there with the cameras in the room saying, we'll have a shutdown. It might be good. Maybe we should have a shutdown. So you don't get the sense that he's all that bothered by this.
Two of our very best friends with us to talk us through just what we're witnessing tonight in Washington and elsewhere, Michael Steele and Eli Stokols. To the story Eli just mentioned and our first break, we are just getting started on this busy Thursday night, but when we come back, what is a widening crisis in the White House, in the West Wing. It's about the departure of another of the aides closest to this president. So, to recap, on top of a government shutdown that is now going to arrive at the top of the next hour, the White House is dealing with significant fallout from the resignation of a top aide tonight. Staff Secretary Rob Porter left his position after two of his ex-wives accused him of physical and verbal abuse. The accusations were first reported by the DailyMail.com, and tonight the White House is calling them serious and disturbing. That's a change over the course of these past few days. Also tonight, there is new controversy swirling around White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. Specifically, what did he know and when? A former White House official tells NBC News that Kelly was alerted months ago about some allegations of domestic abuse from Porter. But the White House is insisting that Kelly learned the whole truth just yesterday. Earlier today, Porter's second ex-wife, Jennifer Willoughby, spoke to NBC News. Kristen Welker, as you see there, about concerns she shared with the FBI last year when they were conducting their background check of her ex-husband.
You told the FBI about your concerns about Rob Porter. What did you tell them?
Yeah, during the FBI background interview for security clearance, I shared with the FBI all the details that I have shared in previous articles, including access to a protective order from June of 2010 and police calls that I had made to our home.
So you told the FBI that Rob Porter was abusive towards you?
Yes.
That same woman gave a long and remarkably composed interview to CNN tonight on live television in which she said she fears for the safety of Hope Hicks, the White House communications director who's been reportedly in a dating relationship with Rob Porter. For his part, Porter denies the allegations and released a statement that read in part, "These outrageous allegations are simply false. I will not further engage publicly with a coordinated smear campaign." Chief of Staff John Kelly initially called Porter a man of integrity on Tuesday, but last night released a statement saying he was shocked by the allegations against Porter and that there is no place for domestic violence in our society. Tonight, our friend Jonathan Lemire of the AP says, quote, "A harsh spotlight is cast upon Chief of Staff John Kelly." We want to bring in our panel to talk about this, led by Raj Day. He is back on the broadcast. He is a former White House staff secretary who served under President Barack Obama, very same job title that was held by Rob Porter. He also happens to be former general counsel to the NSA, National Security Agency, and former principal deputy assistant attorney general. Kimberly Atkins is back with us, chief Washington reporter for the Boston Herald and MSNBC contributor. And Brian Bennett is back with us, White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Raj, thank you so much for being on with us, and I'm afraid I have more than a few questions for you. First of all, in business, job titles are often exaggerated and grandiose. But throughout a lot of official Washington, job titles are often diminutive and understated. The Office of Policy Planning at the State Department sounds like nothing. It's hugely important during normal times. Ditto, Staff Secretary to the President. Tell us about what the job entails, and was there anything in and out of the Oval Office you didn't see?
Certainly, Brian. Well, it is one of the most sensitive, if behind-the-scenes jobs in any White House. Simply put, the role is to manage and review all written material that needs to go to the President of the United States. So think about things like executive orders, decision memoranda, correspondence, highly classified material. The role is twofold. One, to serve as a gatekeeper, to control the flow of information to the President, prioritize what he needs to see, and so forth. And two, to serve as an honest broker, to make sure that what the President sees has been vetted appropriately. if the National Security Advisor wants to send something to the president, to make sure it's been reviewed by the White House counsel if appropriate, and vice versa.
Raj, I have to also ask you about kind of an ancillary issue that you can speak about, and that's security clearances. When someone is hired for a job that's going to include dealing with sensitive matters, the FBI does what they call in the trade a full field investigation. Sometimes you have to put people on a fast track. Sometimes presidents must be allowed to say, I need this guy or this woman right now. Can I hire them while you work on that? Talk about your knowledge of this process and what it seems like Mr. Porter was operating under while, again, touching and seeing and hearing all these secrets.
Well, you're exactly right. The person in this role needs to see everything that the president sees. So needless to say, they have to have the highest level security clearance one can have. That sort of thing doesn't happen overnight, particularly if you're not currently serving in government. So it's not unusual to have what's called a provisional or interim clearance while you start the job. It's highly unusual for someone to be in such a senior role, to be a year into that role, and to have that clearance status still in that same state. I can't say I've heard of a similar instance. You know, I'll tell you, I left this role to serve as the general counsel for the NSA, and I can say unequivocally I had exposure to far wider range of highly classified and sensitive information in the White House than I did as the top lawyer for the National Security Agency.
Kimberly Atkins, let's move to you. We have seen a memo come out tonight from John Kelly that reads like a memo from the CEO of any of the companies that have lately been dealing with cases of harassment. It says to reach out to your supervisor if you feel the need. This is the memo as tweeted tonight by Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. But I have to ask this question. What if your supervisor is Chief of Staff John Kelly? What if your supervisor is Communications Director Hope Hicks?
Yeah, I mean, this shows how complex the problems with this entire situation is when you had someone who's in the White House who had this temporary security clearance, yet in reviewing all of these sensitive documents. You have the person in charge of creating the first communication about these allegations of abuse, and the photographs that came out is the person who was dating the person. It's just an HR guide and how not to do things, and that just complicated an already difficult question, essential question, which is what did the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, know about this and when? And, you know, in legal standards, there's something, when you're talking about knowledge of something, it's whether someone knew something or should have known something. And even if John Kelly said these allegations were only fully brought to him, he was fully aware of them yesterday, he should have known. He was in a position of knowing about the temporary security clearance, at least perhaps being curious about what was holding it up, the permanent clearance, and he should have known these allegations existed, even if he didn't. So it's a problem all around for this White House. My question is how many other people have temporary security clearances that we don't know about, and if there are other people whose clearances are being held up. But it's a big problem for this White House, how it handles itself just in its staffing.
And Josh Dawsey tweeted about this issue of security clearances tonight. I wonder if we have that up in the control room, mentioning one of the more notable people who is lacking a security clearance, and that is Jared Kushner, something that's been kind of an open secret around Washington. So, Brian, our friends Peter Baker and Maggie Haberman over at the Times have, they're on the scoreboard tonight with another story that indicates the long knives are out for John Kelly. There's a vignette in here with the president asking people what they would think about Mick Mulvaney for Chief of Staff. There's a vignette in here about the president showing his frustration with Hope Hicks in addition to Chief of Staff Kelly. What's your read of the state of play?
Well, this episode that we've just gone through with Rob Porter is another indication that John Kelly's credibility is a diminishing asset. And that was the reason he was brought into this job. He was brought into this job to bring order and to what was a very chaotic West Wing. And over the last several months, there have been moments where his credibility has been called into question. He made statements from the podium about Congresswoman Frederica's speech in Florida, for example, where he mischaracterized it. He talked about defended Robert E. Lee. He now has issued this statement defending Rob Porter and had to walk it back. And there's tons of questions about how much he knew about the abuse. And so the very reason that he's there is now called into question. And you can imagine that Trump has been bristling already at some of the patronizing statements that Kelly has made about how Trump, for example, has evolved in his ideas about the wall because of briefings that Kelly gave him.
Raj, I'd like the lawyer in you and the West Wing veteran in you to react to this next bit. This came out tonight. It's the writing of Josh Dawsey and Beth Reinhard in the Washington Post, and it's about White House counsel Don McGahn. In January 2017, when McGahn learned of the allegations, these are the allegations against Porter, he wanted Porter to stay put because he saw the Harvard law-trained Capitol Hill veteran as a steadying professional voice in the White House, according to people familiar with the matter. His view didn't change in June when the FBI flagged some of its findings to the White House, nor did he act in September when he learned the domestic violence claims were delaying Porter's security clearance, or in November when Porter's former girlfriend contacted him about the allegations, according to these people. Raj, it doesn't read well.
Well, it certainly doesn't. I can certainly understand why a calm demeanor is a premium asset in this White House. But nevertheless, for any of these jobs, they're all about discretion, integrity, and judgment, first and foremost, above any other skills. Without that, it almost doesn't matter what other skills a person brings to bear. And so I really don't know what to say about that litany.
Kimberly, it's been talked about and whispered about over the past 48 hours. People have said various versions of Porter looked like a Republican recruitment poster. His dad worked for 41. The guy went to Harvard Law School, was a Rhodes Scholar, kind of tall, looked the part. There he is alongside the Chief of Staff, General Kelly. And it's somehow germane to the conversation that the work Porter was the only part of him that people knew in the West Wing, and that it differs so widely with the man accused of serial abuse.
And it's interesting that that work persona, that professional persona, is what it made it take so long for Chief of Staff John Kelly and others, such as Senator Orrin Hatch, to come out with a statement actually condemning the behavior that he's accused of. It was thought that, no, well, this isn't the guy we know. This guy is upstanding. I trust him. He has great integrity. And it just sort of belies this idea that, people who commit abusive acts are often very charming in their workplaces. They don't go around, walking into the office and saying, hey, I hit my wife yesterday. So it's really strange that that was the justification for so many people to delay believing this or addressing this. It's sort of a new offshoot now of the Me Too movement, that women aren't initially believed. You sort of believe as long as someone seems like a nice guy in the office and he denies it, then it sort of gives people cover not to act immediately, and that's just, it's not acceptable.
Brian, we haven't seen much or heard much from this president. We go into another day tomorrow where a quick look at the schedule shows no public events.
That's right. We're going to be watching closely to see if the president makes any comments about his chief of staff, if he's asked about whether he has confidence in John Kelly. I mean, another thing that's been called into question is just the vetting of people who come into this White House. Again, this is something that the chief of staff is responsible for. He's responsible for making sure that the president's agenda is followed through, but also that it's not distracted by other types of scandals that come out. And it's his job to know if there are skeletons in the closet of anyone on his staff. And, either he did that vetting and knew about it and kept it internal, or he didn't do that proper vetting and that wasn't being done. And it'd be a question to find out as to whether that is part of a larger pattern of a lack of internal vetting going on here at this White House.
Raj, before we lose you, I just want one more question, and that is, I've always said that having been lucky enough to cover the White House, when you get just outside the Oval Office and you get ready to walk in, the world seems to slow down and get very quiet. The carpets are thicker. The walls are thicker. Our friend Steve Schmidt always talks about the lack of rigor in this administration, as he puts it, the lack of professionalism in some of the roles we've seen. Is that how you view this, that this job title you held and took so desperately seriously is now being talked about because of the occupant and his past, and this is just one more nick on this still young administration?
Well, it certainly is ironic that a job whose very focus is about assisting the discipline and focus of the organization that is a chaotic White House in any administration is now the source of further chaos. It couldn't be more poetic in that regard.
Our great thanks tonight to Raj Day, to Kimberly Atkins, to Brian Bennett. A terrific conversation. Thank you all. We'll head for another break. We're continuing our live coverage of this now looming less than a half hour to go until we witness another government shutdown as the White House fights other battles on other fronts.
You know, pretty clear evidence that the Russians meddled. Whether they affected the outcome is another question, but they meddled, and that's dangerous for democracy.
Sounds like it was recorded in prison, but he was delivering remarks there without naming names. You heard former President George W. Bush making it clear, in his view, unlike the current president, he has no trouble accepting that Russians interfered in the U.S. election. Bush, having mostly stayed out of the political limelight, delivered those comments during a conference in Abu Dhabi. There were just not cameras allowed. Former Vice President Joe Biden had some strong words for the current administration. He's been on the tour and spoke with NBC's Andrea Mitchell earlier today.
I just can't fathom. I can't fathom why the president, just as a patriotic American, let alone as president, would not be looking for every single bit of data and evidence that would show what they were doing and what they're attempting to continue to attempt to do. Putin must be sitting behind his desk in the Kremlin going, it's working, man.
Those comments come as we wait to see if and when the White House will release that memo by Democrats on the House Intel Committee that refutes the Republican memo of a few days back accusing the Justice Department of all-around misconduct. President Trump has until Saturday to decide. The GOP memo, as you recall, led to some new reporting tonight from Politico that, quote, FBI surveillance of Carter Page might have picked up Steve Bannon. This report says, quote, the FBI was monitoring Carter Page when the former Trump campaign advisor says he spoke with Trump advisor Steve Bannon about Russia in January 2017, raising the strong possibility that the FBI intercepted a conversation between the two men. Page told Congress in November about the call, but it has been cast into a new light by last week's release of a Republican memo revealing that the FBI was monitoring Page's communications at the time. Bannon, we'll remind you, is not accused of any wrongdoing, but he is under subpoena from the House Intelligence Committee and is expected to speak with the special counsel's team next week. All of this is by way of saying we have asked Kimberly Atkins and Brian Bennett to rejoin us. Wow. Kimberly, where to begin here? The Democratic memo, why is there not as much hubbub around this one, and what are expectations about what's in it according to your and the best reporting?
Yeah, you know, while lawmakers have encouraged the president to release this memo too, we have to remember the president used the Republican memo as evidence of some sort of witch hunt, a Russian witch hunt against him, that the FBI was biased, that they were out to destroy his presidency. So the idea that he'd be eager to release a Democratic memo that essentially refutes all that, you know, it's it's not a surprise to me anyway that it hasn't been released yet. And, you know, this is even though, or maybe in addition to the fact that that GOP memo seems to be the gift that keeps undermining arguments that the president is making regarding the Russia investigation, or throwing other monkey wrenches in. I mean, the Carter Page revelation is the latest one. Because of this memo, we know that Carter Page was under surveillance, and now we know that the surveillance could have picked up Steve Bannon and perhaps even other people in the White House. Carter Page said he doubted that other people were picked up, but he couldn't rule it out completely. The memo also revealed that the investigation wasn't started by this infamous dossier, that it was actually comments made by George Papadopoulos that led to the beginning of this probe. I mean, it sort of undercuts the arguments that the president has been making as much as it supported this notion that it was some sort of politicized endeavor to undermine him.
And just as a point of information for our viewers, as we hearken back to the unmasking mini scandal, when someone is collateral damage in eavesdropping, if you're being surveilled and your conversation with someone else gets recorded, they are usually listed in the transcript as a U.S. person or something like that, unless and until an intelligence official says, hey, who is that? I need to know, it's germane to our investigation because of what they said back. So I wanted to get that on the road. Brian, on the record. Brian, there is an excitement gap between the Republican and the Democratic memo. We should be very candid and say that Fox News kind of rolled out a campaign of coverage aimed at getting the Republican memo revealed. I looked up at Fox News at 3 separate occasions tonight, a sampling of the segments I saw them doing. Macy's selling hijabs, Clinton's and the Uranium One scandal, and most recently, before we came out to go on the air, Confederate monuments in New Orleans. There is no such excitement over the potential release of the Democratic memo.
Well, if you look at these 2 memos and how they've come out to the public, I mean, you can see that there is a masterful disinformation campaign that's been waged here. You had the news cycle dominated last week by the Republican memo, articles and articles and articles written about them, about what it might say, and then a lot more articles earlier this week about what was actually in the memo. Unfortunately, you know, a lot of what was undermining the president's case was buried, and then the Republicans in the House Intelligence Committee, you know, dragged their feet in releasing the Democratic memo, and it's entirely likely that the White House will send a letter to Congress to allow that memo to be released, maybe tomorrow, maybe Saturday. But in the meantime, the initial revelations and accusations that came out in the first Republican memo have just been allowed to hang out there and drift. And, you know, this is part of a larger campaign that the president has launched to try to undermine the Russia investigation. It's really interesting that George W. Bush, who has been nearly silent for so long, did come out and say that he believes that Russia meddled in the elections. And the fact is, the way to prevent Russia from meddling in future elections, including the midterm elections, is to inoculate the public by getting more information about how it was done in the past. And in order to do that, we need to know more about ways that they're, you know, promoting fake news and trying to influence voters' decisions. And the more information that the public knows about the investigation and how it happened in the past, the less likely it is that Russia could have a similar impact in future elections.
Great thanks tonight. Brian Bennett, Kimberly Atkins, appreciate your contributions to our conversation this evening. One final break for us as we approach this midnight witching hour and the shutdown that, however long or short, is starting at midnight. When we come back, a former star of reality television speaking about another who happens to be our current president.
Every critic, every detractor
will have to bow down to President Trump. It's everyone who's ever doubted Donald, whoever disagreed, whoever challenged him.
That gets your attention. That was Omarosa Manigault-Newman in 2016 on Frontline, right before the presidential election. The former Apprentice cast member developed a loyalty to Donald Trump that led to her appointment to this title, Director of Communications at the Office of Public Liaison. But after less than a year at the White House, Omarosa is back on reality television where it all started for her. And she is back in the news because of what we're about to show you. As one does after leaving a West Wing job, Omarosa is currently a contestant on Celebrity Big Brother. And in this scene you're about to see with her housemate, who came to fame as Ross the Intern on the Jay Leno Tonight Show, Omarosa talks, albeit at a barely audible whisper, about her time in the Trump White House.
I was haunted by tweets every single day. Like, what is he going to tweet next?
Does anybody say to him, what are you doing?
I mean, I tried to be that person.
Who has that power to say what's going on?
No, I'm not there. It's not my circus, not my monkeys. You know, I'd like to say not my problem, but I can't say that because, like, it's bad.
Should we be worried?